Good morning, everyone. I am Charlotte, and I am a maritime historian and archaeologist working with the Ocean Foundation on an underwater cultural heritage project called Threats to Our Ocean Heritage. And we're very proud that this work has been endorsed as an activity under the UN Decade for Ocean Science. And it's also in a partnership with some great organizations like the Lloyd's Register Foundation. So this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the UN Decade and how it can be used to strengthen the work that all of us here are really trying to do to protect heritage at risk. And I'm also going to go through some of the specific risks that we focus on in our project. So while the UN Decade for Ocean Science has hundreds of endorsed ocean science-based activities, projects, and programs, these all relate to natural heritage and ocean biosciences. There's very few endorsements that focus on cultural heritage. There is the Cultural Heritage Framework Program, which is led by the UN Decade Heritage Network. And this was the first one, and to date, it's one of the only ones still that has to do with cultural heritage. That is also until our project came along, and we were able to be an officially endorsed action within the Cultural Heritage Network. So this means that we're working to help ensure that fishing, mining, and potentially polluting wrecks are safer for individuals, businesses, and societies. And it also means that we can help advocate that these activities can be done in a more sustainable way for those who are dependent on a healthy ocean for their life and livelihoods, and in a way that helps protect underwater cultural heritage. We're also very fortunate to have some of the framework program team, as well as the Heritage Network team, writing contributions for the books and helping develop the themes. And I think it's kind of a good overall message sort of to show that this cultural heritage isn't traditionally, thought of as part of the UN Decade for Ocean Science, but there's no reason why it should be like that. And it's super relevant to a lot of heritage work out there. So our project specifically is a collaboration between the Ocean Foundation, the Lloyd's Register's Foundation's Heritage and Education Center, and it's also working with the International Committee on Underwater Cultural Heritage, ICUCH, which is within the International Committee of Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS. The project is organized by the Ocean Foundation, which is the only community foundation for the ocean, which is dedicated to reversing the trends of destruction of ocean environments. And it's one of the few ocean-based NGOs that focuses on both natural and cultural heritage. That's going to be a big theme as I go through this presentation, the link between the two types of heritage. And this means that the Ocean Foundation is in a really great place to bring this project to light and a lot of these issues to light. One of the main outputs of the project is going to be 3 books, one on each of the threats, and 2 of which are going to be published by Springer, and the final seabed mining book is being considered for ICOMOS's Heritage at Risk series as well. And luckily, the first round of chapters for the bottom trawling book and the polluting wrecks books are into the editors, so we hope to have them out next year. And one of the reasons we're so glad that we're working with our partners is because it's enabled us to be able to release each book as an ebook online with a free open access option. One of the key goals of this project, and I think the UN Decade in general, is to have a lot of the material be easily accessible to everybody, not just people with an academic background or those with institutional access to journals and books. I mean, while working on this project, since I've already graduated and I'm not with the university anymore, I've lost access to tons of the resources that I would like to use. So we're really, really excited we're going to be able to have this out for everybody to read. We're also planning to be at various conferences over the next few years, thinking, SHA, EAA, the UN Decade for Ocean Science, as well as the 2001 Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage. We'll hopefully be at these meetings, and we'll have some paperbacks of the books to distribute as well. But we also don't want the work we're doing and the educational resources that are created while we're writing the books to stay within this super traditional paper-bound mode. One of the Ocean Foundation's next tasks after the books are published is going to be turning the material into various forms of multimedia to engage with all sorts of stakeholders and interested parties. This can be in the form of, short form videos, which might act as a teaser trailer for more long form videos. And these long form videos could be interviews with the authors of the different chapters in the book, as well as other experts in the fields, or maybe, you know, very palatable, possibly animated, easier for children, various ways to summarize each book. We'll also be working with our graphics team to have various sort of infographics to be able to share around on social media and utilize the younger generation, who I think have a really impressive willingness to campaign for change and are very vocal when they're unhappy about things. And I think it's a really good resource to tap into for a lot of the threats we're looking at. And finally, the sort of final output is going to be more for the polluting wrecks topic. And that's going to be a series of 4 workshops in 2024 that are going to be designed to bring researchers, policymakers, government representatives, and other stakeholders together to talk through the issue and work towards a resolution. So we've got a lot coming up in the next couple of years. I'm going to go through now sort of the 3 threats we were talking about and a little summary of each one. And bottom trawling was the first one that kind of kicked off the project for us. And I also find it's the one that sometimes people outside of maritime archaeology or very underwater cultural heritage base, it's sometimes the one that people are the most familiar with as well. So as a lot of people know, every day, thousands of kilometers of the seabed are plowed by trawlers, destroying both cultural and natural heritage. And it was first mentioned in 1376 in an English parliamentary petition. And even then, trawling was regarded as a catastrophically damaging practice with lasting negative consequences on seabed ecology and marine life. And flash forward to today, and people are still saying the same thing. And though legislation can limit trawling, and that can help the biological communities rebound, the archaeological material lost can never be recovered. So maritime archaeologists and marine ecologists really need to start working together and communicating, and especially working with fishermen and policymakers, all to find a way to limit the harm. But as we stand today, that's not really happening, and trawlers are continuing to bleed the sea dry. They're destroying habitats without giving ample time for recovery, and they pull in 60 to 80% of a fish population per year. Other ways that the gear can affect the seabed can be classified as scraping and plowing, sediment resuspension, and the physical destruction, removal, or scattering of non-target species. Fishing operations can further affect the seabed through the waste dumped from the vessel. And there's also a lot of indirect effects, which can be related to the different stresses imposed on the ecosystem. And what's interesting is this whole thing happened because fishermen were trying to keep up with the declining stocks, and that's still happening today. So there's a marine scientist, Callum Roberts, and he's estimated that a trawling vessel today takes in only 6% of what they could have 120 years ago. So there are literally fewer fish in the sea because of human practices like this. And it's not just the fish populations or the fish habitats that are being destroyed. Important shipwrecks and artifacts are lost as well, and they have been since the beginning of the practice. Archaeologists have pretty recently begun raising awareness about this, but of course, more work is needed. For example, coastal trawling is particularly destructive since it's where most of our known shipwrecks are located. But that also doesn't mean that we should restrict our focus to coastal trawling alone, because as technology improves, archaeological expeditions will move further out to the deep sea, and those sites need to be protected as well, especially because that's where a lot of legal trawling is happening. And these deep sea sites are valuable treasure troves because traditionally they've had sometimes the least human influence, and because of various water conditions, they have some of the best preservation for shipwrecks. Additionally, in the deep sea, which we'll get on our next topic as well with seabed mining, that those are ecosystems that take a very, very long time to bounce back from any sort of stress or disturbance. So trawling is happening out there in the deep sea. It's probably already damaged a lot of shipwrecks that we haven't even found yet, which is really sad. And the damage to shipwrecks can include a lot of things as well. Mixing sediments, it can cause changes to the chemical degradation process of the shipwreck. Artifacts can be damaged or moved, which means the site's context is a bit destructed. Additionally, as you can see here in this photo, nets and other fishing gear can get caught on the wrecks, which will warp any metal features. And if it's a wooden shipwreck, it will slice right through the hull. So again, the vessel's integrity is usually pretty destroyed after a trawling has come through. But what's a bit tricky there is that it's hard to map the history of trawling on a site because any scrapes on the seabed tend to heal over time. And if an artifact was removed and it's the excavator's first trip to the site, they wouldn't even know it was there to begin with. So that's also what sort of shows the importance of ongoing surveys of sites. And that's something that we talk about a bit in the book and with some case studies. Luckily, there have been a few regional studies in the recent years that kind of help present the danger that historic sites face. And to give a stat relevant to the North American heritage at risk, in the North Atlantic, nearly 70% of all of the known shipwrecks in the mid-Atlantic have trawling damage. So that's just one small area of the Atlantic with that high of a percentage. So you can imagine where it is in the rest of the world. And I find it interesting too that it's not just shipwrecks that are destroyed by trawling. One of the sites worst affected by it is Doggerland, which was a big area that was inhabited during the Mesolithic period. But thanks to sort of climate changes and changing sea levels, it's now underwater in the North Sea. And for centuries, it even, begins in the 1800s, trawlers have pulled up stone tools, they've pulled up a Neanderthal skull, there's been a mastodon tooth, and a lot more that have just come up in the nets. And it's an interesting point there too, that these nets will then, the artifacts will come up in the nets, they'll come up onto the fishermen, and the wrecks pose a problem to these fishermen as well. If they're snagging their gear on a shipwreck, it's often ruined or needs to be replaced, and that's expensive. Plus, it puts their lives at risk with the risk of capsizing of the vessel. There's no legal framework for the fishermen to report any wrecks or artifacts that they encounter, despite there being similar regulations for oil companies or pipelines when they find archaeological material. It is true that sometimes archaeologists have only been aware of a shipwreck because a fisherman has reported it, but they are not required to do so. So as I said, a clear partnership between the archaeologists and the fishermen is also needed to be able to go forward with this. And that's something we're focusing on in the book as well, that we're going to give a much more detailed historical overview. We're really going in depth about the ecological damage there and the legal context to kind of situate this issue. We've also got a number of case studies, including one from a US marine sanctuary. We have some from the Mediterranean and Turkey, some about the deep water surveys and what they're finding. And we're also getting to introduce some new research initiatives. And what's really cool about these ones is they're very much based in working with fishermen and kind of coming to a solution that everybody's happy with. So the second sort of issue we talk about in our project is a future challenge facing underwater cultural heritage. And this is from deep seabed mining, or DSM, which is an operation that interacts with both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So I'll start with an overview of DSM for those not familiar. I definitely was not before I started working on this. But deep seabed mining is a potential commercial industry which is attempting to mine mineral deposits from the seafloor in the hopes of extracting commercially valuable minerals such as copper, cobalt, zinc, and rare earth metals. However, the mining is posed to destroy a thriving and interconnected ecosystem with a staggering array of biodiversity, which is the deep ocean. So commercial DSM hasn't started yet, but various companies are trying to make it a reality. And the current proposed method of the nodule mining basically includes the deployment of a mining vehicle, which you can see down here, which is usually kind of looks like a tractor. It's about 3 stories tall, and it gets dropped down to the seabed, where it's then going to vacuum up the top few inches of the seabed, sending everything it pulls, sediment, rock, crushed animals, underwater cultural heritage, everything comes up to a vessel at the surface where it's then sorted, the minerals are taken, and anything they don't want will just be chucked straight back into the ocean. So currently, the International Seabed Authority is kind of who's regulating the proposals for this, and their exploration and exploitation draft regulations are not sufficiently protective of cultural heritage. For example, they do not require the real-time monitoring of operations or the transmission of relevant data that would enable identification of UCH. So if there's a camera on the mining vehicle and it sees it's coming up to a shipwreck, nothing is in place to say they have to send that data to an archaeologist to look at, or that they have to pause operations before they destroy it. And this is just for tangible heritage, because DSM is also going to be impacting intangible cultural heritage. In one specific example, noise from seabed mining has the potential to negatively impact local practices, such as shark calling, as well as the migration of whales, which has cultural importance to a lot of people globally. There's also been concerns raised about DSM's interaction with some cultures' understanding of responsibility to the ocean or their special regard for the deep ocean. And all of these conversations haven't really found a place in the regulatory development at the ISA, but there is a new intersessional group meeting to work on this that luckily the NGO or the Ocean Foundation has been invited to be part of some of those conversations. So we're hoping that UCH is going to get in there, but it does really just highlight that seabed mining is this threat, but it's a unique opportunity because it's a future threat. You know, we've seen what have happened with trawling. We've seen sites be destroyed. We have the chance to possibly get better regulations into a practice before the same thing happens, which is exciting. And again, we just have kind of a slight map that we made that sort of shows some of the heritage at risk. So all of the light shaded areas are different sort of minerals that the mining companies want to target. And then drawn onto the map as well in red is some of the known paths for the Middle Passage in the Atlantic slave trade, which for a lot of people is whether they were forced migration, the forced migrants were basically the sea is their final resting place. And so as you can see, it goes across quite a few of the areas that are proposed to mine. And one of the other big risks as well is World War II wrecks, which you can see just a tiny, tiny sampling covered here by the green dots as well. And especially in the Pacific, it's just all overlapping there. Which with World War II wrecks brings us to our final of the threats that we cover in our project. And it's also a unique one because it shows a threat to heritage, both cultural and natural, that can come from the material itself. So the wrecks from the World War are considered part of our cultural heritage, but they're also posing a significant threat to our marine environment through pollution. So fishing and other livelihoods that are dependent on a healthy ocean are at risk from a form of cultural heritage. A potentially polluting wreck is a shipwreck containing a cargo or a large volume of its own fuel that remains within the wreck when it sank. And so it has the potential to cause an environmental hazard should that structure become compromised and it would leak, or there might be an explosion and a huge release. The wrecks identified as PPWs are most commonly thought to be those sunk during World War II, particularly oil tankers, obviously, but it can also include freighters or ships from the 20th century that might have sunk in a storm or for other reasons. And it's an interesting ecological thing because only in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon spill and an extensive amount of research that was conducted in the Gulf of Mexico, that gave scientists a much better understanding of how high the risks to environmental impacts and to systems, especially deep sea ecosystems, that oil can sort of pose. And so today, sometimes when we have an oil leak, the origins are sometimes known, but a lot come from mystery sources and will pose future damage. And that's a big topic covered in the Polluting Wrecks book, which is intended to be a resource on the subject that will synthesize previously published information. And much of that has been published in government documents or online materials that weren't academically or scientifically produced. This is a lot of international studies and shipwreck databases and some reports posed on the threats posed by World War wrecks containing oil and other hazardous materials that can spill. So the book will be evaluating these materials as well as presenting new analysis and investigations with modern technology that's going to help assist in locating, documenting, and remediating polluting wreck sites. So project-wide, we have some big themes and goals that we want to address. And mainly, as you might have picked up, it is showing the link between the natural and the cultural heritage of the ocean and showing that the two usually cannot be separated. For example, with the dugong in Japan and with Hawaiian coral, both are regarded as joint heritage, so both natural and cultural. And this brings us to the title of the project, Ocean Heritage, which we've sort of coined as a term because it is showing that the ocean is natural and cultural and they need to be considered together. The stories of our society and our ancestors are wrapped up in the intangible connections with the ocean, and they're captured on the seafloor as artifacts, shipwrecks, and the remains of those lost or buried at sea. Previously, marine global heritage has largely been based on natural heritage. However, underwater cultural heritage is also ocean heritage, and it needs to be respected in the same way. This is why our project is designed to shine a light on this and insist that ocean heritage is part of marine spatial planning with integrated ocean and coastal management. We also wanted the books as an educational resource to help give a bit of a legal overview and context for the issues at hand. So we have a lot of discussion of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which does recognize a broad but arguably vague duty to protect objects of historical or cultural nature. And we also have the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, which gives more detail on how to implement this duty to protect. So we show through that the control of trawling and mining and the management of PPW should be integrated into this duty to protect underwater cultural heritage that's shown in both conventions. And as we said a bit earlier, UCH is already part of the UN Decade for Ocean Science. So it follows that the science of archaeology and the conservation of UCH should be considered in the next steps for sustainable development of our ocean heritage. Considering the potential serious and irreversible harm that we just covered that comes from these activities, precautionary action is paramount. So in line with this, we kind of have a couple of measures that we hope should be taken with this. We're advocating that the science-based decision-making must be made based on baseline surveys, which need to identify the ocean heritage. Again, that's both natural and cultural. And we need to show what might be adversely affected by harmful activities. This can best be accomplished through marine spatial planning surveys and including any UCH that's at risk to be put in a marine protected area and set aside, such as they did with the Titanic. A precautionary global moratorium on these activities until the surveys, environmental and cultural assessments, and all of that is conducted. And also those marine protected areas are set aside. We should have a pause on these activities until we can do that. We do not have enough baseline information to be able to monitor change and potential harm. And to us, that's the first step that needs to happen. We need to get those surveys out there. We need to have protected areas. Because the natural and the cultural heritage of our world, as I said, are intertwined and both need to be protected. And it's been recognized since the 1972 World Heritage Convention for this. For example, in the US, one of our marine national monuments, the Papahanaumokuakea, I think, became the first mixed natural cultural UNESCO World Heritage Site in the US. So that shows that there is precedent for this of having both natural and cultural being weighted equally in protection. And other sites can follow suit for this. It's time to take the considerations that started in the terrestrial environment and extend them out to the territorial sea and the continental shelf, as well as application in the area under the high seas. So all this comes together to show that the lack of awareness for UCH threats, especially outside our own field, this highlights the need for more education of and outreach to policymakers, stakeholders, governments, the public, and other scientific professionals on this issue. For example, leads of ministries of cultures or archaeological programs or others focused on cultural heritage might benefit from being made aware of or invited to discussions focused around deep seabed mining. They should be part of the drafting of the regulations, the standards, and the guidelines that are occurring at Seabed Authority meetings, and a lot of times are unaware that it's happening. So that's one of the main goals of the project is an educational resource to really get to all manners of stakeholders this information out there. And through presentations like this, or at conferences, or with our books, that's what we're hoping to do. There's a lot of really great further resources as well on all of these issues, especially on bottom trawling. But I wanted to highlight two resources to get more information on the polluting wrecks or the seabed mining, because I found that talking to a lot of other heritage professionals, and for me too, before I got into this project, these were the topics that we were sort of sometimes less familiar with. So here's a citation for Michael Brennan's article. He is actually the editor-in-chief of our Polluting Wrecks volume. And he just published a really great article that kind of boils down all the key points about polluting wrecks to focus on. And we also, the Ocean Foundation has a really, really great website and resources for seabed mining, be that the UCH risks of seabed mining, the nitty-gritties of the Seabed Authority, what's actually happening, any question you might have, the Ocean Foundation resource is really great for that. And additionally, I've got my email there for further questions, and I think we probably have some time for questions today as well.